What if the power you have been searching for has never been outside of you, never hidden in circumstances, never waiting in some future moment, but has always been operating within you, quietly, consistently, shaping everything you experience through the images you accept as real in your own imagination? Because if you look closely, not at the surface of your life, but at the source of it, you begin to notice something profound. There is only one creative power, and it is not separate from you. It is within you, expressing through you, as you. And yet most of your life has been lived as if that power were somewhere else, as if it belonged to something external, something distant, something you must reach, earn, or be chosen by. But what if that entire assumption is the very thing that keeps you from seeing what has always been true? Because the moment you believe the source is outside, you begin to wait, you begin to doubt, you begin to separate yourself from the very thing that is creating your reality. So again, quietly, are you looking for power, or are you willing to recognize it as yourself? Because the idea that there is something greater than you, something above you, something separate from you that controls your life may feel comforting. But it also removes responsibility. It removes awareness. It removes the recognition that everything begins within your own consciousness. And once you see that, even slightly, something shifts, not in the world immediately, but in how you relate to it. Because now you understand that imagination is not fantasy, it is not escape, it is not wishful thinking, it is creation itself. Every image you accept, every scene you dwell in, every assumption you return to is forming your world. Not symbolically, not eventually, but inevitably. And this is why belief matters. Not as an effort to convince yourself, but as a reflection of what you are already accepting as true. Those who hear this and dismiss it will continue to experience life as something happening to them. But those who hear it and test it, who dare to assume something different, begin to move into a different experience entirely. Because once you assume something as true and remain in that assumption, the world reorganizes itself to reflect it. Not because you forced it, but because it cannot do otherwise. Reality does not argue with your assumption. It expresses it. So the process is not complicated, but it requires honesty, it requires awareness, it requires that you stop pretending you are powerless and begin to see that everything you experience is connected to what you accept within yourself. And this is where the shift begins, not in what you do, but in what you dare to assume. Not in effort, but in identity. Not in chasing, but in being. Because the moment you accept that the creative power is within you, you can no longer return to the idea that you are separate from it. And once you see that, everything changes. And once you begin to accept that the creative power is not outside of you, but operating within you as your own awareness, something else becomes possible. Something you may not have considered before. You are no longer limited to imagining only for yourself. You can imagine for others. You can lift them, change their circumstances, alter their direction, not by force, not by persuasion, but by assumption, because the same law applies, whether it is directed toward your own life or toward another. Imagination, when accepted as real, must express itself, and this reveals something even deeper, that the world you see is not made up of separate independent forces, but of states interacting within one consciousness. And that consciousness is what you are. So again, quietly, do you see others as separate from you or as part of the same field of awareness? Because if you see them as separate, you will believe that their life is beyond your influence, that their situation is fixed, that their limitations are real. But if you begin to see them differently, not as bodies moving independently, but as expressions within the same consciousness you occupy, then something changes. You realize that what you assume about them matters, not as opinion, but as creation. And this is why imagining lovingly for another becomes powerful, not because you are controlling them, but because you are selecting a state for them within your own awareness. And that state, if sustained, must externalize, because there is no other creative power operating. So you take someone not physically, not externally, but inwardly, and you see them as you desire them to be, not hoping they will change, not wondering if it is possible, but accepting it as already done. You hear them tell you the good news. You see them living differently. You feel the satisfaction of their success as if it has already happened, and then you leave it there. Because the moment you interfere, you return to uncertainty. But when you remain in the assumption, the process unfolds naturally, often in ways you could not have predicted. Because imagination does not need your control, it only needs your consistency. And this is where trust becomes real, not as blind belief, but as understanding. You know what you have done, you know what you have assumed, and you know that it must express not because you force it, but because it is law. So the question sharpens again. Are you willing to assume the best for others without needing proof first? Because that is the test. Not when it is easy, not when it is visible, but when there is no evidence, when everything suggests the opposite, and yet you remain in the state you have chosen. And when you do, something begins to move, quietly at first, subtly, almost unnoticed, but inevitably, because once a state is accepted, it begins to organize reality around it, and that includes them. Because they are not outside the law, they are within the same field as you. And when you begin to use imagination, not only to think but to assume, something shifts in a way that is almost imperceptible at first, because you are no longer imagining as an observer, you are imagining as the one who is already within the experience. And that distinction is everything, because the moment you place yourself inside the scene, instead of outside of it, you collapse the distance between you and what you desire. You are no longer looking at it as something separate, something distant, something to be reached. You are experiencing it as something present, something real, something that already includes you. So again, quietly, are you observing your desire, or are you inside it? Because if you are observing it, you are still reinforcing separation. You are still identifying as the one who does not yet have. But if you are inside it, you are no longer waiting. You are being. And being is what creates not wanting, not hoping, not visualizing from afar, but embodying from within. And this is why feeling becomes the key. Not emotion in the surface sense, but the inner sense of reality. The quiet conviction that this is happening, that this is true, that this is yours. And when that feeling is accepted, even briefly, something begins to reorganize within you. Your identity adjusts, your inner speech changes, your reactions begin to soften, and without trying to control anything, you have already shifted the cause. And once the cause is shifted, the effect must follow. Not because you demand it, but because it cannot do otherwise. Because reality does not originate outside of you. It reflects what you are being, so the process becomes simple again. Not easy perhaps, but clear. You enter a scene that implies fulfillment. You experience it as real. You allow the feeling to be natural, not forced, not exaggerated, just quietly accepted. And then you leave it, not abandoning it, but not interfering with it, because interference comes from doubt, from checking, from wondering if it worked. But when you truly enter the state, you do not need to check, because you are no longer trying to make it happen. You have already experienced it. And experience leaves an imprint. It changes you. It defines you. And once it defines you, it must express. So the question sharpens once more. Are you willing to feel it as real before you see it? Because that is the threshold. Not when it appears, but when it feels like you. And when it feels like you, it is no longer something you are trying to create. It is something you are already being. And this is where the real test begins. Not when you're alone and imagining, not when the state feels beautiful and easy, but when the outer world rises up and shows you something completely different from what you have assumed. Because in that moment, the issue is no longer imagination, the issue is loyalty. Loyalty to the state you have chosen over the evidence that surrounds you. And most people do not fail because they cannot imagine. They fail because they do not remain faithful. When appearance begins to argue with assumption, they see contradiction. And instantly they return to the old man, the old conversation, the old fear. And in doing so, they hand their power back to the shadow. But the shadow has no power of its own. It only reflects what you have already been. So again, quietly. When reality denies you, who do you become? Do you become the one who reacts, who doubts, who asks whether any of this is real? Or do you remain the one who has already accepted the unseen as fact? Because that choice is the turning point. That inner movement decides whether the new state deepens or collapses. And this is why faith is not emotional enthusiasm. It is not intensity. It is not drama. It is fidelity. Quiet fidelity to an imaginal act that has not yet broken through the surface of the world. And if you can remain loyal there, if you can refuse to let appearances define your identity, then you are no longer living from effect. You are living from cause. And cause is always greater than effect, always deeper, always prior, because the outer world is late. It is always late. It is always showing you what you've already been, never what you are now choosing to become. And if you do not understand that, you will keep letting old evidence talk you out of new identity. But if you do understand it, then contradiction loses its authority. You can see it without submitting to it. You can witness it without becoming it. And that is the discipline. Not to force yourself into blindness. Not to deny the senses in some tense, artificial way, but to understand their place. They report what has been. They do not decide what will be. Only assumption decides that only the inner acceptance of a state has creative power. So when the world says no and your chosen state says yes, you do not fight the world. You simply remain. You return inwardly to what you've already accepted. You refuse to let a temporary reflection define a permanent choice. And each time you do this, the state strengthens. It becomes less fragile, less borrowed, less like a mood, and more like a self. And once it begins to feel like self, you are no longer practicing it. You are inhabiting it. And what you inhabit will inevitably organize the world around you, because reality has no independent will. It mirrors the identity you consent to within yourself. So the question sharpens again. Are you more loyal to appearances or to your assumption? Because one keeps you in repetition and the other moves you into creation. And the moment you stop negotiating with the visible and remain faithful to the invisible, something irreversible begins. The new state stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling like truth. And when it feels like truth, the world must eventually bow to it. And when you become faithful to the assumption instead of negotiating with appearances, something else begins to disappear almost by itself. And that is the restless urge to keep doing, to keep checking, to keep repeating the imaginal act out of fear that it might not work. Because once a state is truly entered and accepted, your task is no longer to create it again, but to stop abandoning it. And this is where many miss the whole secret. They imagine beautifully for a moment. They feel the wish fulfilled. They touch the state. But then, instead of resting in it, they begin to disturb it. They look for evidence. They test the world. They ask if anything is changing. And every one of those movements returns them to the state of not having, because the one who checks is still waiting, and the one who waits is not yet being. So again, quietly. Are you imagining because it is done? Or are you imagining because you fear it is not? Because these are not the same thing. One comes from fulfillment, the other comes from lack. And whatever you do from lack only deepens the identity of someone who does not yet possess what is desired. But when you imagine from fulfillment, even once, even softly, even without intensity. Something within you receives the impression and begins to accept it as natural. And when it becomes natural, it stops being a practice and becomes a self. And this is why rest is not laziness. Rest is faith. Rest is what happens when you no longer feel the need to interfere with what has already been accepted within consciousness, just as a seed, once planted, does not need to be dug up every hour to make sure it's growing. Your assumption once planted does not need anxious repetition. It needs protection from contradiction. It needs stability. It needs your refusal to re-enter the old state. And that refusal is the deepest form of discipline, because it is quiet, invisible, and inward. No one sees it. No one praises it. No one even knows it is happening. But it is there every time you choose not to undo what you have done. Every time you feel the impulse to check and instead remain. Every time you refuse to let time become an argument against your chosen identity. And this is where trust becomes something much more profound than belief. It becomes a way of being, a settled stillness that says, I do not need to force what is already in motion. I do not need to repeat what has already been accepted. I do not need to beg reality to become what it must become. Because the imaginal act, when truly felt, is not a request, it is a claim. And a claim once made in consciousness begins immediately to shape the pattern of events, though the senses may not yet register it. And if you can live there, if you can remain in the quiet completeness of what is already done, then something extraordinary happens. The pressure fades, the urgency dissolves, the need to monitor every outer movement disappears, because you're no longer the one trying to make something happen. You're the one from whom it is already happening. And once you know that, really know it, you stop spending energy on fear and begin investing it in being. And being is always enough, because being is the cause of everything. And when you finally stop disturbing the seed with fear, with checking, with repeated return to the old state, something begins to reveal itself with a clarity that cannot be ignored. And that is this: the world has never been acting on its own. It has been reflecting you all along. Not your passing wishes, not your occasional affirmations, not the words you speak when you are trying to feel better, but the state you actually return to, the one you accept as normal, the one that feels most like me, because that is the only level from which reality responds. So again, quietly, what if nothing in your life is random, and everything is only echoing what you have inwardly agreed to be true? Because that is the real shift. Not merely to imagine a new scene, not merely to feel something beautiful for a moment, but to understand that the entire outer world is a mirror, and a mirror cannot initiate, it cannot choose, it cannot decide, it can only reflect what is placed before it. And if what is placed before it is the identity of struggle, then struggle returns. If what is placed before it is the identity of completion, then completion must begin to appear. If what is placed before it is uncertainty, delay will follow. If what is placed before it is calm conviction, then life begins to take on the shape of that conviction. Not because you force events, but because events are only shadows of the state that casts them. This is why trying to change the world directly is exhausting, because you are working on the reflection instead of the source, and no reflection has power to change itself. The source is always within. The source is the state. The source is the one who says, I am, and quietly fills in the rest. So if you say, I am still waiting, the world reflects waiting. If you say, I am not chosen, the world reflects rejection. If you say, I am already secure, the world begins to organize itself around security. And the deeper truth is that this happens whether you're aware of it or not, which means your power has never depended on knowledge, only on use. You have always been using it. The question now is whether you will use it consciously. And conscious use means you stop asking the world for permission to feel differently. You stop demanding evidence before assumption. You stop measuring reality by appearances and begin measuring it by identity. Not what do I see, but what am I being. Not what is happening, but what state is being expressed here. Because every event, every pattern, every repetition is telling you something about the assumption that has been active beneath the surface. And once you begin to read reality this way, something changes in your relationship to difficulty. You no longer feel victimized by it. You do not need to fight it. You do not need to dramatize it. You simply trace it back to the state, and then you change the state. Quietly, inwardly, deliberately. And that is power. Not the power to dominate people. Not the power to manipulate circumstances by force, but the power to alter the source from which all circumstances come. So the process becomes almost startling in its simplicity. Notice the reflection, identify the state behind it, choose a different state, and remain there long enough for the mirror to catch up. Because the mirror is always later than the movement that causes it. And this is why patience is not waiting, it is understanding lag. It is knowing that what appears now belongs to what was believed before, and what is being believed now will appear next. Once you understand that, you stop being hypnotized by current appearances. You stop calling them final. You stop letting them define you. Instead, you let them instruct you. They show you where you have been, but they do not get to decide where you are going. Only your chosen state does that. And once this becomes clear, not merely intellectually but experientially, you stop trying to fix life and begin to govern it from within, because you finally understand that the outer world was never the cause. It was only ever the witness. And when you begin to see the world as witness rather than cause, something deeper settles into you, something quieter than confidence and far more stable than hope. And it is this. You stop asking reality to tell you who you are, and you begin deciding that from within, because as long as you wait for the outer world to confirm your value, your safety, your success, your place, you remain at the mercy of reflections. And reflections are always late, always secondary, always shaped by what has already been assumed. But the moment you reverse that order and decide first, assume first, become first, the entire structure of your life begins to reorganize around a new center. So again, quietly, have you really decided who you are, or are you still negotiating with appearances? Because negotiation is weakness. Not moral weakness, but imaginative weakness. The weakness of still believing that what is seen has the right to overrule what is known within. And that is the very habit that keeps the old state alive. But decision ends negotiation. Decision says, this is who I am now, not because the world has proved it, not because circumstances support it, but because I have accepted it as true in consciousness. And consciousness is the only place where anything is ever born. And this kind of decision does not feel dramatic. It does not need intensity. It does not need applause. It feels almost still, almost ordinary. Because real assumption is never theatrical. It is natural. It is the quiet shift in identity where something no longer feels like a wish and begins to feel like self. And when that happens, you stop reaching. You stop checking. You stop asking when. Because when belongs to the state of not having. And you are no longer there. You are now occupying a different place within yourself. One from which the desire is not in front of you, but within you, not separate from you, but fused with your sense of being. And that is why time begins to lose its emotional charge. You may still see movement unfolding, yes, but you are no longer measuring your worth against the pace of appearances. You are no longer counting days like someone waiting at the door. You are living from the premise that the thing is done. And because you live from that premise, your reactions change, your choices change, your tone changes, your inner conversations change. And all of this happens not because you are trying to improve yourself, but because identity has shifted, and identity always carries behavior with it. So the power here is not in effort, it is in consistency. Not rigid consistency, not tense control, but the kind of consistency that comes when there's nowhere else you wish to return to. Because once you have tasted the quiet dignity of being the one who already is, the old state begins to feel smaller, louder, more desperate, more exhausting, and you stop romanticizing it. You stop pretending that fear is honesty or that doubt is intelligence. You begin to see them for what they are, all rooms in consciousness that you no longer live in. And that is when the state becomes stable, not because no contrary thought ever appears, but because contrary thoughts no longer have authority. They pass, but they do not define. They speak, but they do not command. And when they no longer command, the new self begins to stand on its own, not as an exercise, not as a temporary uplift, but as fact. So the question sharpens one final time. Are you willing to remain as this new self, even before the world applauds it, even before the results are public, even before those around you understand what has changed? Because that willingness is the seal. That willingness is what turns assumption into identity, and identity into destiny. And once that happens, reality does not need to be pushed. It begins to conform with the same inevitability with which an echo follows a sound. You do not chase it, you hear it returning. You do not force it, you recognize it arriving. Because from this point onward, you are no longer trying to become the person who has the life you want. You are learning to stand so steadily in the assumption of that life that the world can only do one thing in response: reflect it. And then, almost without any dramatic announcement, the struggle begins to disappear. Not because life has stopped moving, not because desire has vanished, but because the one who was straining, checking, doubting, and trying to force results is no longer the self you inhabit. And that is the true ending of the process. Not the moment when the outer world finally gives you visible proof, but the moment when you no longer need proof in order to remain who you have chosen to be. Because that is when the assumption has become identity, and identity is the only thing reality truly answers to. So again, quietly, what if nothing has ever been withheld from you, and the whole drama was only about whether you would remain faithful to the unseen, long enough for it to become your natural self? Because that is what has been happening all along. You were never trying to force life. You were never wresting circumstances into submission. You were never meant to beg the visible to change. You were learning to become inwardly stable, inwardly loyal, inwardly fixed in a state that the world had not yet mirrored. And once you did that, everything else became secondary. Not unimportant perhaps, but secondary. Because when the cause is settled, the effect is only a matter of expression. And this is why peace begins to replace effort. Not because you have given up, but because you have arrived at the point where being is deeper than wanting. Wanting always reaches. Being simply is. Wanting watches the door. Being knows the door has already opened. Wanting asks when. Being has no such question. And once you move into being, the emotional charge around time dissolves. You no longer count days with anxiety. You no longer measure your worth by what has appeared. You no longer give appearances the authority to define your state. Instead, your state defines the meaning of appearances. And that reversal changes everything. Because now the world is no longer your judge. It is your witness. It is no longer the thing you obey. It is the thing that echoes. It is no longer the source. It is the shadow. And once you really know that, not as an idea, but as an inner realization, you stop surrendering to surface evidence. You stop allowing delay to mean denial. You stop mistaking movement for absence. You begin to understand that what is unseen is not less real, but more real, because it is causal, because it is primary, because everything visible is only the late arrival of what consciousness has already accepted. And now the final question becomes unavoidable. Are you still waiting for reality to become what you want? Or have you finally become the one from whom that reality must come? because that is the difference between a life of reaction and a life of creation. One is governed by what appears, the other is governed by what is assumed. One pleads with circumstances, the other speaks from identity. One repeats the past, the other selects the future. And once that becomes clear, the whole journey simplifies into one quiet responsibility. Choose the state, enter it, remain in it, and do not betray it, just because the outer world arrives late. That is all. Not because it is small, but because it is absolute. And when you do this long enough, sincerely enough, steadily enough, something irreversible takes place. The new self no longer feels borrowed. It no longer feels imagined. It no longer feels like a practice. It feels like you. And when it feels like you, the world must rearrange, because reality cannot consistently reflect what you are not. It only reflects what you have accepted yourself to be. So in the end, the secret was never hidden in methods, never locked inside techniques, never reserved for the chosen. It was always there in the simplest and most demanding place possible. Your willingness to govern your inner world more faithfully than you react to the outer one. And when you finally do that, when you stop abandoning your chosen state, when you stop negotiating with appearances, when you stop looking outside for permission to be who you have inwardly accepted, the whole thing becomes almost shockingly clear. Reality has never been leading you, it has always been following you.